Today, we are going to analyze an incredibly complex and profoundly tragic chapter in Canadian criminal history. Between 2010 and 2017, a series of disappearances in Toronto started to really shake the city's sense of security. And this was particularly centered on the Church and Wellesley neighborhood, which is, known as the city's LGBTQ village.
And what started as fear, as rumor, it eventually evolved into an investigation of just staggering scale. I mean, we're looking at the largest criminal investigation ever conducted by the Toronto Police Service, the TPS, and it was all focused on 8 men whose lives were tragically cut short.
The grim resolution, as many of you will know, focused on one man, Thomas Donald Bruce McArthur. By all outward appearances, he was just a completely unremarkable 66-year-old self-employed landscaper. His arrest in January 2018 and then his guilty plea to 8 counts of first-degree murder a year later, it brought a painful but, well, unnecessary kind of closure.
And we really have to place this in its historical context. The source material makes it clear that McArthur is the most prolific known serial killer to have ever been active in Toronto. And on top of that, he's the oldest known serial killer in Canada. That whole 7-year period, from 2010 to 2017, was just a horrifying time for an already vulnerable community.
So our goal here today, using the source material we have, is really threefold. First, we need to understand the criminal investigation itself, which was just massive, unprecedented. Second, we must ensure we honor the memory of the 8 victims. So many of them were marginalized, living hidden lives. And finally, we absolutely have to critically examine the intense controversies around how the missing persons cases were initially handled, which, well, it revealed some deep-seated issues of systemic discrimination.
And I think it's really important, we have to start with a note on sensitivity here. Our sources repeatedly highlight that McArthur sought out and exploited highly vulnerable targets. We're talking about men who were immigrants, asylum seekers, or homeless. These were individuals who were often navigating life on the margins, maybe already distrustful of authorities or forced by circumstance to keep their lives hidden. So we're going to commit to focusing solely on the factual findings of the investigation and the systemic issues that it revealed, treating their stories with the respect they are absolutely due.
The terrifying pattern didn't start with a bang. It really started with a whisper, didn't it? It was just these individual disappearances that, for years, the police really struggled to connect. The first victim identified in the investigation's final timeline was Skandaraj Skanda Navaratnam. He was a 40-year-old Tamil refugee from Sri Lanka.
Navaratnam was last seen in the early hours of September 6, 2010. He was leaving a well-known gay bar in the village called Zippers, and he was a man with few resources, which made him specifically vulnerable because he had no immediate family in Canada to, press for an investigation or file a missing person report quickly.
And the court documents later revealed a crucial detail. Navaratnam and McArthur already knew each other. They had ties, both sexual and professional, that went all the way back to 1999.
Exactly. So this wasn't an opportunistic killing of a stranger.
Yeah.
This was a relationship, however tenuous it might have been, that stretched back over a decade. It wasn't a sudden escalation. It was built on pre-existing connections and access.
So by November 2012, police were concerned enough about Navaratnam's fate to launch a formal task force. It was called Project Houston. But it's really fascinating and disturbing how that investigation even got started.
It had a highly unusual and dark starting point. The initial belief that Navaratnam had been murdered was triggered, in part, by a user post on a really shocking web forum called Zambian Meat. This post claimed in graphic detail that the user had killed and consumed a man in Toronto.
Wow. Okay, so that must have been a huge distraction immediately.
It was. There was even a brief lead linking the user to Luca Magnotta, who had recently been involved in a very high-profile, brutal murder.
Wait, let's just pause there. So Project Houston gets launched partly on this belief of murder, but the initial, really sensational lead pointing toward Magnotta that had to be abandoned pretty quickly. What does that tell us about the early stages of this whole thing?
It tells us the police were flying blind. I mean, they were searching for any possible explanation for why these men were just vanishing without a trace. They had this extraordinary online claim, which turned out to be completely spurious in this context, and the only concrete thing they had was a missing man, a man who had just ceased all contact. They were looking for a high-profile suspect when the actual killer was entirely mundane.
Okay, so by June of 2013, Project Houston's scope had expanded beyond that online lead. And they started to focus on connecting Navaratnam to 2 other middle-aged South Asian immigrants who had also disappeared from the Church and Wellesley area.
Right. These were Abdul Basir Faizi, who was 42, and Majid Hamid Kaihan, 58. Faizi was an Afghan immigrant last seen at the end of December 2010. Our sources emphasize that Faizi was leading a profoundly complex double life. He wasn't out to his family or his colleagues. And that double life, that forced secrecy, it provided McArthur with the perfect camouflage. And then there's this. Faizi's car was found abandoned near Mallory Crescent. That's the same property where McArthur stored his landscaping equipment.
That proximity is absolutely chilling. So a victim's car is found right where the eventual killer stored his tools. And what about Kaihan?
Kaihan, also an Afghan immigrant, was the son of a Muslim cleric and was strictly closeted from his family. He was last seen in October 2012. And he wasn't just an acquaintance. The sources confirm Kaihan actively pursued McArthur romantically. So these three men, Navaratnam, Faizi, and Kaihan, they showed these striking commonalities. Middle-aged, immigrants, frequenting the same area, and often living lives hidden from their wider families.
And this convergence, it brings us to what might be the most critical failure point of that early investigation, the failed interview in November 2013. The police were given an anonymous tip pointing directly to McArthur, linking him to both Navaratnam and Kaihan.
It was a gift. It was a gift of information they just couldn't convert into a case. The task force interviewed McArthur, and according to the records, he was seemingly calm, cooperative. He admitted to regular interaction with Navaratnam. He confirmed he had employed Kaihan and, crucially, had a sexual relationship with him, although he falsely claimed he'd broken it off.
He was in their grasp. They had him. They had the geographic link with Faizi's car, the demographic overlap, the anonymous tip, and McArthur's own admission of close ties to two of the missing men. How could Project Houston possibly conclude that no evidence to link the disappearances existed, or even more damningly, no evidence a crime had been committed?
That is the pivotal question, isn't it? It plagued all the subsequent reviews. The conclusion was based on a lack of hard forensic evidence at that moment. McArthur offered plausible, though, as we now know, false explanations for his knowledge of the men. And legally, a missing person case doesn't equal a homicide. Without a body, without blood, without a confession, the task force felt legally constrained. The terrible consequence, however, was that the trail went ice cold. The investigation was wrapped up without a suspect, and this allowed McArthur to continue his activities for several more years, exploiting the very weaknesses the police had just, in a way, confirmed.
When we look at the years between 2013 and 2017, we have to understand how McArthur could operate with such confidence. It seems to hinge entirely on this elaborate, calculated double life he maintained, which served as the perfect mechanism for concealment.
Thomas Donald Bruce McArthur, born in 1951, he grew up in Lindsay, Ontario, which is a pretty traditional rural environment. The source material paints a picture of intense internal conflict, and it was fueled by a religious upbringing. His mother was a devout Irish Catholic, his father a Scottish Presbyterian, and it strongly suggested that his father may have sensed the young McArthur's emerging homosexuality, which was seen as completely unacceptable in that rural conservative setting back then.
And that internal struggle led him to construct a life of rigid suppression. He built this facade of the conventional family man. He married Janice Campbell at 23 in 1974, had 2 children, was active in his church. The sources explicitly state he kept himself consciously busy, a traveling salesman, a family man, specifically to avoid confronting his own feelings.
But that rigid structure, it started to crack in the early 1990s when he began having affairs with men. He finally came out to his wife, which led to their separation in 1997, and then his move to Toronto. This geographical shift allowed him to finally frequent the gay bars of Church and Wellesley, though he lived about 5 kilometers away in the quiet residential area of Thorncliffe Park.
And it's important to note this transition coincided with profound financial difficulty. He faced legal troubles with his son, declared bankruptcy in 1999. It was then that he started his own business, Artistic Designs, a landscaping operation. And this is where that facade becomes weaponized. His landscaping job required him to visit multiple properties, establishing relationships with often wealthy, elderly women who trusted him. This innocent professional cover later provided him with perfect, unguarded locations for storage and eventually for disposal.
But before the start of the murder spree in 2010, we have this critical precursor event, the 2001 assault. On Halloween night, McArthur followed an actor and model named Mark Henderson into his apartment after being invited in to see a costume. And once he was inside, he attacked Henderson repeatedly from behind with an iron pipe.
McArthur turned himself in, claiming a very convenient and highly suspicious memory loss. The resulting legal outcome in April of 2003 is just vital to understanding the systemic failure we're talking about here. He pleaded guilty to assault with a weapon and assault causing bodily harm.
The sentence was a conditional sentence of 2 years less a day. For listeners who might not be familiar with Canadian law, receiving 2 years less a day is often a strategic move by defense lawyers to keep their client out of a federal penitentiary. It ensures the sentence is served in the community under strict conditions or in a provincial facility. The fact that he avoided federal jail time was significant.
But the conditions themselves were exceptionally restrictive. It suggests the judge saw a high risk.
Precisely. He was given 1 year of house arrest, 3 years of probation, and was explicitly barred from the entire church and Wellesley area, the very neighborhood he would later use as his hunting ground. He was also forbidden from possessing amyl nitrite, a muscle relaxant, and compelled to undergo psychological counseling and anger management. A defense lawyer at the time even commented on the record that the sheer length and specificity of those conditions strongly indicated the judge still perceived him as a high danger to the community.
So he was flagged as a potential danger to the gay village community back in 2003. But then comes the procedural time bomb that just erases this historical context entirely.
The pardon. In 2014, McArthur applied for and was granted a record suspension. It's essentially a pardon. This expunged the 2003 conviction from his criminal record, from criminal background checks. And to make matters worse, most of the police records and exhibits related to that case had already been destroyed by the TPS in 2010, years before the pardon was even granted. They were just complying with their internal retention policy.
That is the devastating insight here. The failure wasn't just that he got a pardon. The core systemic issue was that compliance with the standard procedural rule-destroying police files after a set period created this complete vacuum of necessary historical information. If he'd been questioned in 2016 or 2017, his record would have appeared clean. This allowed him to hide in plain sight.
Absolutely. The system facilitated his concealment. Meanwhile, McArthur was deeply entrenched in the gay online community. He was actively hunting. He was prolific on gay dating and fetish websites, things like Recon, Silver Daddies, Grindr, Growler. His profile on Recon, which he shockingly registered while his 2001 assault case was still pending, openly listed his interest in BDSM and submissive men.
He was just weaving his way into the social fabric and at the same time maintaining this quiet life in Thorncliffe Park. He even cataloged his participation in local nightlife on Facebook, often being photographed with younger men, specifically of South Asian or Middle Eastern descent, a clear sign of his targeting strategy.
And this polished facade, it would occasionally shatter, giving people these glimpses of the volatility underneath. The sources cite 2 important anecdotes. In 2011, he exploded at an acquaintance named Robert James, screaming profanities after James merely mentioned hearing disturbing stories about McArthur.
And the second incident, in 2013, is just as telling. He became enraged at a restaurant owner, A.J. Khan, who just innocently questioned him about his boyfriend being seen the previous day. McArthur reacted violently to any challenge to his carefully constructed narratives.
These weren't isolated moments of simple anger. They illustrate a profound lack of emotional control and an ego that violently rejected any suggestion that his carefully constructed reality might be flawed or questioned. This intense volatility was a key sign of the danger hiding behind the mask of the charming landscaper.
So the failure of Project Houston in 2013 meant the hunting just continued, completely unchecked. And the community fear, which had been simmering for years, it just boiled over in 2017 with the disappearances of 2 more men, which finally forced police action.
The first was Selim Aysen, a 44-year-old Turkish citizen, last seen in March 2017. He had struggled with addiction, but he'd been working hard, having recently completed a peer counseling certificate. The second man, whose disappearance proved to be the pivotal moment, was Andrew Kinsman, 49. He vanished in June 2017, the day after Toronto Pride.
Kinsman's profile was significantly different from many of the earlier victims, wasn't it? He was known as stable, responsible, a very prominent, visible community volunteer. He wasn't navigating asylum or extreme poverty. And crucially, like Navaratnam, he was connected to McArthur. He had a decade-long sexual relationship with him.
The community's reaction to Kinsman's disappearance was immediate, and it was vocal. This urgency, combined with the underlying fear from the earlier unsolved cases, led to the launch of Project Prism in late July 2017. This task force was explicitly established to investigate Kinsman and Aysen, but also mandated to actively look for links back to the men from the failed Project Houston.
And here we see the technical advantage that Project Prism had compared to Project Houston. The breakthrough didn't come from an anonymous tip. It came from Kinsman's meticulous habits.
That's right. Police found the name Bruce noted on Kinsman's personal calendar for June 26th, the day he went missing.
Just Bruce.
Just Bruce. That was the initial name to chase. The key forensic link came from surveillance video near Kinsman's residence, which showed Kinsman approaching a distinctive vehicle, a red 2004 Dodge Caravan.
It's a common vehicle, but police were able to isolate a key physical identifier.
The van had specific chrome siding, so police cross-referenced the 6,000 similar vans registered in Toronto with known individuals named Bruce who had ties to the area. McArthur, who lived nearby in Thorncliffe Park, emerged as the only Bruce who owned that specific 2004 model. That detail, the specific year and trim, was the critical physical link they needed.
The police were operating on a razor-thin margin here because McArthur, in September 2017, had sold that crucial piece of evidence, the van, to an auto parts shop. Had they waited any longer, that evidence might have been completely destroyed.
They tracked it down immediately. The van's new owner confirmed that trace amounts of blood were later found inside. That blood was analyzed and positively identified as Kinsman's. And this was the moment. The circumstantial links of Project Houston finally solidified into irrefutable forensic proof of murder.
So once they had Kinsman's DNA in McArthur's vehicle, the investigation accelerated dramatically. It transformed from a missing person inquiry into a homicide investigation.
They immediately obtained tracking warrants for McArthur's vehicles and phones, which allowed them to construct a detailed timeline of Kinsman's disappearance. And even more damning, forensic analysis of the van yielded DNA evidence that also matched Salim Asen, the other man Project Prism was launched to find.
So now, armed with DNA evidence linking McArthur to 2 homicide victims, police had the legal justification to obtain a general warrant in December 2017. This led to a crucial high-stakes move.
This was the covert entry into McArthur's apartment. A police team secretly entered the premises and cloned his computer's hard drive. This was a massive undertaking. The risk involved was enormous, but the objective was to find definitive proof before McArthur could destroy it, or worse, kill again.
And the payout was immediate and terrifying.
On January 17, 2018, just a month after that covert entry, a partial forensic download of deleted files from that cloned hard drive yielded the most undeniable proof. Hundreds of postmortem photographs of the victims. This was the moment any doubt evaporated. Police immediately ordered round-the-clock surveillance with explicit instructions to arrest McArthur the moment he was seen alone with anyone. The fear was absolute. He was actively hunting.
And the arrest came the very next day, January 18, 2018. It was a direct intervention that likely saved a life. Police moved in when McArthur brought a young man, referred to in court documents as John, back to his apartment.
The sources confirmed the officers entered the apartment just as McArthur was initiating an attack. John, whom McArthur had met on the Growler app, was already restrained, handcuffed to a steel bed frame. McArthur was attempting to tape a black bag over his head. The immediate arrest, based on the officer's belief that the man's life was in imminent, extreme danger, prevented the 9th murder. This whole shift, from the struggling Project Houston to the highly focused Project Prism, was a race against a ticking clock.
McArthur's arrest just opened the floodgates. It initiated the largest forensic investigation ever undertaken by the TPS. The initial search covered 5 properties, but attention immediately focused on his apartment and that crucial Mallory Crescent residence in Leaside.
The Mallory Crescent property was ground zero for the disposal of remains. McArthur had an arrangement there. He maintained the yard in exchange for storage space. In November 2017, before McArthur was even officially identified, cadaver dogs had visited the site but failed to detect anything, likely because the ground was frozen solid.
But after the arrest in January 2018, the dogs were brought back, and they took a very strong interest in these large frozen planto boxes that were stored on the property.
On January 29, 2018, police brought in heaters to thaw the contents of the planters, and inside they made the gruesome discovery of dismembered skeletal remains belonging to at least 3 people. This immediate discovery allowed police to lay 3 additional charges of first-degree murder almost instantly.
And these 3 victims, Majid Kaihan, Sarush Mahmoudi, and Dean Lissowick, they showed just how far back and how wide McArthur's activities stretched. Kaihan was the missing Project Houston subject. Sarush Mahmoudi had been missing since 2015. And Dean Lissowick was a homeless man who had, shockingly, never been reported missing at all.
The investigation confirmed McArthur's meticulous use of his landscaping cover. The planters yielded 7 sets of remains. The 8th victim, Kaihan, was ultimately found later, in the summer of 2018, located in a forested ravine compost pile behind the property. He had literally disposed of bodies in the flower beds and a compost heap of his clients.
The scope of the forensic investigation just demonstrates the effort required to make up for those initial investigative gaps. The search of McArthur's tiny apartment lasted nearly 4 months.
It was exhausting work. It required 10 forensic officers who cataloged over 1,800 items and took 18,000 photographs. The thoroughness was paramount because they were dealing with a timeline spanning 8 years, and they had to ensure every piece of trace evidence was recovered and tied to the individual victims, some of whom had disappeared nearly a decade prior.
We have to pause now and just reflect on the 8 men whose lives were stolen. We've mentioned Navaratnam, Faizi, Kaihan, Eason, and Kinsman. Let's look at the 3 whose disappearances really highlight the ultimate invisibility of the marginalized.
Soroush Mahmoudi, who was 50, was a refugee from Iran, and he was married. Like many of MacArthur's targets, he wasn't publicly known within the gay scene. He had, however, been in a 4-year relationship with a transgender woman before he got married, showing a history of seeking relationships outside of traditional frameworks. His secrets, too, made him vulnerable.
And Dean Lisowick, 43 or 44, stands out in the investigation as a man who just fell completely outside the system's notice. He was homeless, a former drug user, and a sex worker who often stayed at a shelter. The tragic reality that he was never even reported missing just underscores the community's failure to protect its most vulnerable. It made his disappearance the easiest to conceal.
And finally, Karushna Kumar Kanagaratnam, 37. He was a Sri Lankan Tamil asylum seeker. He was living under a deportation order and had not been reported missing either. He was actively hiding within the Tamil community, working cleaning and moving jobs, terrified of being deported. That enforced secrecy, that fear of authorities, made him a perfect target.
The evidence presented in court painted this chilling portrait of MacArthur's targeting strategy. The victims all had ties to the church and Wellesley area, 6 were of South Asian or Middle Eastern descent, and most shared similar physical traits, often featuring facial hair or a beard.
The unifying characteristic was not just their physical appearance, but their vulnerability. MacArthur actively sought out and exploited characteristics that provided him with maximum advantage for concealment. Temporary residences, secret lives, lack of strong family or community ties to demand a rigorous search or a fear of authorities. This was calculated predation based on systemic neglect.
The sheer scope of this disaster forced the TPS to expand its view beyond just the immediate 8 victims. Investigators temporarily expanded the cold case review to 600 files and specifically looked into 15 homicide cold cases in the gay village dating back as far as 1975. They were worried MacArthur might be linked to earlier deaths.
Ultimately, they found no forensic evidence linking him to those older cases, but the exercise itself highlighted how many historical unsolved cases existed within that community, reinforcing that long-term perception of neglect.
The decision by MacArthur to plead guilty to all 8 counts of first-degree murder in January 2019 was a monumental relief for the victims' families and the community. It spared them the grueling process of a long, painful trial.
It did. However, the sentencing hearing that followed was crucial, as it was the venue where the court heard the disturbing factual details necessary to understand the premeditation and the extreme depravity of the crimes. The court confirmed that 6 of the murders were sexual in nature and that 5 involved elements of confinement.
The sources detail the specific method of killing, ligature strangulation.
Yes. The court heard that he sometimes used a specific mechanism, a rope twisted with a metal bar wrapped in tape, which allowed him to control the pressure during the strangulation. This device was later found in his van, and it contained DNA from both Kinsman and Eason, confirming its use. This level of preparation really speaks to the calculated nature of the violence.
And what truly illustrates the depth of the methodical planning are the details of his post-defense rituals. These weren't crimes of passion, they were crimes of systematic collection and display.
He kept trophies. The sources confirm he hoarded personal items from his victims' jewelry, a notebook, among other things, and most disturbingly, he meticulously stored hair from the victims in Ziploc bags, which were recovered from a shed he used near a cemetery.
The digital evidence recovered from the clone hard drive was even more shocking. The sources note the recovery of hundreds of post-mortem digital photographs.
And these photos were not just incidental, they were often staged. They showed the victims nude or posed with clothing and restraints, sometimes even a fur coat or a hat. Additionally, some images showed the victims after MacArthur had shaved their heads and beards. These post-mortem actions are highly indicative of a ritualistic drive that went far beyond the act of killing itself, demonstrating a complete dehumanization of the men he murdered.
During the sentencing debate, the Crown argued vehemently for a sentence that reflected the enormity of the crimes. They asked for 50 years of parole ineligibility.
They cited the calculated exploitation of his victims' vulnerabilities, his lack of remorse, and the strong probability that he would have continued killing had he not been apprehended mid-attack. The defense, citing his advanced age, argued that such a long period of parole ineligibility was unduly harsh, especially given that his guilty plea did simplify the judicial process.
Justice McMahon ultimately sided with the lower bar, sentencing McArthur to life imprisonment with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. This means McArthur can apply for parole when he is 91 years old. The judge was clear, however, stating that McArthur showed no evidence of remorse and called the crimes pure evil, acknowledging that while the sentence was not one of vengeance, it was highly unlikely he would ever be granted parole. It was a sentence meant to ensure he died behind bars.
The McArthur case didn't just expose a killer. It exposed profound systemic failures within Toronto's institutions. The years-long delay and the initial dismissal of community concerns made the investigation itself a subject of intense controversy.
Let's start with the police denial. Even in December 2017, months after Project Prism was launched, but before the arrest, TPS Chief Saunders made a public statement that was instantly controversial. He said, "The evidence today tells us there's not a serial killer."
The police defense for this reluctance was procedural. They argued they were constrained by court admissibility standards and lacked formal prosecutable evidence of homicide or connection until that DNA and digital evidence emerged in January 2018.
But how does that defense sit with the community that had been sounding the alarm for years?
It rings hollow to critics. Activists like Nikki Ward voiced intense frustration, arguing that police had sufficient information to issue stronger public warnings and dedicate resources earlier. They had those early hunches, as Detective Sergeant Idsinga later admitted, but their inability to convert that circumstantial evidence into prosecutable proof meant they failed to prioritize the investigation at a level commensurate with the community's fear.
And this denial fueled these deeply painful and serious allegations of institutional racism and bias. The perception among activists and commentators was clear. The police only launched a serious, resource-heavy investigation, Project Prism, when Andrew Kinsman, a white, well-connected community member, went missing. This was compared to the earlier victims who were primarily men of color and immigrants.
This is where the analysis becomes really complex. Detective Sergeant Idsinga denied racial motivation, stating that Kinsman's case was pivotal simply because of the concrete technical lead, the calendar note, and the van that it provided. However, we have to acknowledge the external perspective provided in the sources. The response to the disappearances of brown-skinned men was comparatively weak, not just from the police, but from the broader public, and crucially from segments of the gay community itself.
So the finger-pointing wasn't just at the TPS. There was an analytical finding suggesting that internal racism or bias within the community might have also played a role in the lack of urgency, viewing the marginalized men as less missing and more gone away or transient.
That is the complex nuance. If the broader community rationalizes the disappearance of marginalized men, men who already live secret or unstable lives, then it dramatically lowers the perceived stakes. It makes it easier for law enforcement to deprioritize the files. This confluence of systemic and social bias created the perfect blind spot for McArthur.
Then we had that painful moment of the victim-blaming backlash in February 2018 when Chief Saunders made those deeply controversial remarks suggesting that the police had been hampered because nobody was coming to us with anything.
The reaction was swift and it was fierce. Community groups rallied outside police headquarters demanding his resignation. While Saunders later apologized, claiming his comments were misconstrued, the damage to the fragile trust between the TPS and the LGBTQ community was severe. Regardless of his intent, the statement was interpreted as blaming the very people who felt abandoned and targeted.
And now we have to look at the most staggering operational failure, the 2016 missed opportunity. Sources detail a high-stakes incident in June 2016, a full year before Kinsman's disappearance, where McArthur was questioned by police for an alleged attempted strangulation in his van.
This was McArthur mid-act, interrupted. The victim escaped and immediately reported the assault. When police questioned McArthur, he claimed the entire incident was consensual BDSM activity gone wrong. The police believed him. They let him go.
Why? Why did they believe him when they had a victim reporting an attempted murder?
Because of the systemic failure we just discussed. When police ran McArthur's name, his 2003 assault conviction had been fully expunged by the 2014 pardon. They lacked the crucial context that McArthur was a convicted violent offender who had previously attacked a man with an iron pipe. Lacking that historical context, MacArthur's claim of consensual BDSM appeared plausible, whereas it would have been instantly discredited if his history were known.
This complete procedural blackout meant that a formal charge of attempted murder was not laid, and a clear pattern of escalation was missed.
That failure led to direct internal scrutiny. A Sergeant Paul Gauthier was charged by the Professional Standards Unit with insubordination and neglect of duty. The charge stemmed from allegedly failing to follow proper policy, like videotaping the complainant's statement and getting photographs of the injuries.
Gauthier publicly defended himself, claiming he was being made a scapegoat. He argued that the initial reports were available and that the decision to release McArthur was made in consultation with his supervisor. And while he was eventually found not guilty of the internal charges, the whole episode exposed these deep flaws in how the TPS handled these kinds of complaints, especially when the victim's narrative might be seen as ambiguous or easily dismissed by police who lack the full background context.
The combination of overwhelming public pressure and these undeniable investigative shortcomings finally forced the institutional response that was needed. In July 2018, the TPS established a dedicated missing persons unit. This was designed as a central hub to digitize and review thousands of old files, aiming to flag suspicious disappearances much earlier.
But the most comprehensive response was the external review commissioned by the Civilian Toronto Police Services Board, led by Justice Gloria Epstein. This was a deep, critical examination of TPS practices, biases, and the obstacles that prevented highly marginalized men like Lisowick and Kanagatnam from even entering the system as official missing persons.
The findings, delivered in 2021, were damning. They offered no comfort to the status quo. The review concluded that the TPS did demonstrate systemic discrimination. It stated unequivocally that the service's practices, if not culture and structure, prevented it from most effectively investigating the disappearances of these missing men. The report was thorough. It made 151 concrete recommendations for systemic change.
The significance of 151 recommendations cannot be overstated. It implies the problems were just deeply rooted and highly procedural. The interim TPS chief accepted all of them, acknowledging the inexcusable investigative shortcomings. This entire tragedy, while born of one killer, forced a mandatory, painful reckoning with bias and procedure.
When we synthesize this entire investigation, from the first disappearance in 2010 to the Epstein review in 2021, you see the anatomy of a failure rooted in systemic gaps. Bruce McArthur was a master manipulator who utilized the legal process, the destruction of records, to completely erase his history of violence.
And that procedural failure was amplified by the investigative failures, specifically Project Houston's inability to connect the dots in 2013, despite having McArthur in the room. The initial lack of investigative priority given to victims based on their race, immigration status, or housing stability allowed McArthur to continue operating for years, exploiting the very factors that rendered his victims invisible to both law enforcement and, in some cases, the wider community.
The enduring legacy of the Bruce McArthur case, tragically, is the mandated institutional introspection and systemic change within the TPS. The investigation was ultimately solved through excellent forensic police work in Project Prism, but the subsequent review explicitly confirmed that systemic discrimination had caused the delays that led to the deaths of several men.
So the question we are left with as citizens, as listeners, is profoundly challenging. How do we prevent this from happening again? We have the procedural reforms, the new missing persons unit, the official acknowledgement of bias. But systems rely on human interpretation, and the targeting pattern McArthur exploited, going after those who already exist on the margins of society, is a persistent vulnerability.
And that leads directly to the final provocative thought we want to leave you with, based on the material we've analyzed today. How can law enforcement ensure that protective systems, even digitized and reformed ones, prioritize the safety of the most vulnerable and marginalized individuals when their disappearances often fit into patterns that society or even members of their own community might already rationalize away due to pre-existing bias or judgment?
It requires vigilance not just from the police, but from everyone within the community, ensuring that visibility equals value, especially for those whose lives are already structured around necessity, secrecy, and fear.
Indeed. The fundamental lesson is that systemic change only begins with self-awareness and constant vigilance.
Thanks for listening.